Hello everyone. Thank you first of all for being here tonight on this very cold evening. I promise you it will be worth it. My name is Meghna Chowkat and I'm a communications officer for the School of Global Affairs here at King's. So tonight we are here for the launch of our new video series called The World Made Me, in which some of our academics share their personal stories of how they got interested in research and the journey that took them from there to where they are now as some of the leading experts in their fields. So no matter what stage of your career you are in, whether you are an undergraduate or postgraduate student just trying to figure out what your area of interest is, or whether you're a PhD scholar who's trying to carve out a niche for themselves, it's always helpful to hear people's stories to help you carve out a path for yourself. So today, to share with us their personal stories, we have Dr. Helen Adams, who is a senior lecturer in climate change adaptation, Dr. Gabrielle Samuel, or Gabby, who is a lecturer in environmental justice and health, and Professor Kate Schreckenberg, who is a professor in environment and development, and also the head of the Department of Geography. So welcome, and thank you for being here. So let's start by seeing what this video series is all about.
I've always cared about climate change. I've always cared about climate change since I was a teenager, and it's the only thing I've ever wanted to work in.
I think of myself as a critical geographer, which means that I don't think of knowledge production or geographical research as an end in itself, but that there is a larger stake here, which is, the stake of social justice.
I'm really excited. Changing disciplines from life sciences to bioethics to medical sociology to now kind of health sociology, and contracts and contracts and contracts. To have a permanent position is amazing.
So you can watch this series on our YouTube channel. We are releasing one video every week. Now, the reason why we call this series The World Made Me is that as we were filming the stories, we realized that the people, the places, and the ideas around them really have a great role in shaping our researchers. And this is especially true with the early formative experiences that get people started. So let's begin with some origin stories.
When I was in high school, I remember reading this book called In an Antique Land. It's a book by Amitav Ghosh, who is now a very well-known writer. And this book was a sort of non-fiction and fiction combined version of his PhD dissertation in history. And I remember reading the book and feeling really fascinated by it, and then turning over and looking at the author bio, and it said the author read history at St. Stephen's College in Delhi. And I think I was about 15 years old then, and I was like, yeah, that's what I'm gonna do.
To go back maybe before sixth form, the reason why I probably got into academia was I was probably not radicalized, but I was inspired maybe from year 10 sociology. Yeah, this is cheesy, but my sociology teacher encouraged me to ask questions, to be curious, and it was from there, I got a little taste of social sciences and carried it through, and I was really just looked at education as a way of asking questions and trying to answer questions and to kind of self-teach.
So it's interesting how for both Shilata and Nathaniel, it's these very early experiences that they had as teens that set them on this path. So I wanted to ask you over here, did you have any such formative experiences? And what did you want to be when you were 5? And how did that change by the time you became a teenager?
You first.
Well, I wanted to become a teacher when I was 5.
Me too. But then I got to be a teenager and I realised it was absolutely horrible keeping a class in check, and so I was definitely not going to end up as a teacher. But I had a lot of experience with my father, who worked for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and so he was always in different countries, and I would visit him every summer. He was an agricultural economist, and he didn't stop work when I came. He would just take me along, so I would get to see far-flung places, very rural areas, farmers working extremely hard and often still being quite hungry. And so for me, that was quite a formative experience, and I just wanted to, small ambition, feed the world, basically. That was my ambition. So I felt I had to go down a route of botany and learning how to produce more food, which is what I thought the solution was at the time.
Nice. And what about you, Helen? You said that you always cared about climate change.
Yeah, I think it was. I'm from Essex. For those that hadn't told, I think it's a bit obvious. There was floods in Essex, big floods that came down the North Sea, and a lot of Essex got flooded. But I think it was in like the 50s, and we had a book on it in our house.
Oh.
And I think, if I think about it, I think it was that book on the floods and I suppose extreme weather that then got me into climate change. And then I think, so I wanted to be a meteorologist at about 8. And then I realised that was really hard.
What did you think it was back then? Telling the weather?
Anything about the weather, yeah, knowing the weather. I loved weather. So I suppose the climate thing started with the weather and extreme weather. So I haven't veered too far. And actually, I did meet an old school friend who I hadn't seen for like 20 years. Cop. He's a policeman in Glasgow, and I met him at Cops in 26. And he said, it was nuts. He said to me, "Oh, you did it, Helen." Because obviously at school, I was banging on about climate change or banging on about the environment, and he remembered that. So I've been fairly consistent, I think.
It's bravo. What about you, Gabby?
So, a completely different path, slightly more superficial. When I was younger, I wanted to be a doctor.
Okay.
I was only interested in being a doctor. And then apparently, and then when I was about 16, I spent some time, 16, 17, doing work experience at the Human Genomes Mapping Project. And therefore, I decided I wanted to be a doctor of genetics. And I read Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, and became completely obsessed with it. And so I went on and did science and did my PhD in genetics and went, oh, this isn't like what you read in the textbooks. Oh my God. And then I started my very long transition journey to discovering the world outside of science and to realise how science is actually a social construction and that actually there's all these other issues at play. And I think, I feel like I'm still on that journey that's kind of taken me, like as the clip said, right, from science to thinking I'll do bioethics and argue about science, but then realising that arguing is a little bit too superficial because it's more complex, so then kind of moving over to sociology and social justice. And then coming full swing into thinking about environmental issues, because like you, I was always fascinated by waste and why people waste. Because I try not to waste things, and that really fascinated me.
So I guess the common thread over here is just the curiosity about something around you, something that you see around you. But so the curiosity and that spark is one thing, but actually being able to carve out a career for yourself from that curiosity is quite something else. And let's hear from Andreas what that looks like.
I am a political scientist. I did political science in my undergrad, and I was working with public policies in Brazil. To be more specific, I was working with the fight against hunger in Brazil, like social policies. And it really puzzled me, for example, how do you find the extreme poor in Brazil? So you design a policy to give cash to the poorest people, but then you face the problem that the very poorest don't have an ID, they don't have a bank account, so how do you locate them? So I was very interested in understanding more about the design of the public policy, but then the implementation of it. And from a government level where I was, I couldn't really answer all these questions. So I thought I should go in academia, but not only in academia, I thought about doing ethnographic research, really doing field work to find out more about the nuances of, the places where the politics then happen.
So with Andreas, it seems like she got into this job and, on the field, as she worked, she realized the questions that were not being answered and what she wanted to answer and how she wanted to do it. But it's not always easy to come to a conclusion about what you really want to study specifically. So I just want to know from you, from your interest in food security and your interest in genetics and yours in climate, how did you actually arrive at that and decide this is what I want to study in my undergraduate or my postgraduate?
I can go if you want.
Yeah, go on.
I suppose I was a bit less engaged in my teenage years. I was concerned with having fun, and so I wasn't really paying attention to what I would do for my degree. But so the person who influenced what I did from undergrad was my Russian teacher.
Oh.
So I'm so dorky, guys. These are my 3 students from my climate change class have come. I basically did Russian out of school because, oh God, at some point, no, I can't do this. Anyway, she was an important person in my life, and she was doing a, what do you call it? Open university degree, part-time in geology.
Oh.
And she said, why don't you do geology? So I did geology.
So that's what you studied for your undergrad?
Yeah, biology and geology. Yeah, mainly geology.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't actually, that wasn't any kind of informed decision.
Okay. But how was it once you actually got into it?
I think, this is probably why I'm an academic, I think I can get into anything once I'm in it. So we'll get on to the PhD. I didn't really choose my PhD topic either. So that was completely opportunistic. But once you're in it...
So in your case, the world really did make you...
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, so I can't lie about those things I did, and yeah, they weren't from any passion. I actually didn't know how you choose a degree.
Yeah.
And then you're choosing a degree at the same time that you're trying to figure out what can I get the best marks in and what's going to get me a job. And at that point, you're not really just thinking about what's the what's the best uni I can get into. I was trading off all those decisions.
And where you're going to have the most fun at uni.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Right?
Although I hated uni, which is funny for an academic. I really hated it. I don't know why I came back and now I live in one. But anyway, that was me.
What about
quite opportunistic as well. So I didn't do genetics and undergrad. I did biochem because I wanted to be a clinical doctor, and it seemed like the closest thing that's not a clinical doctor. And when I was there, it was genetics was the thread that I was most interested in, which is why I stayed there. But again, I did my PhD in Australia because it was opportunistic. I wanted to live in Australia, and there was a scholarship available, so that's what I did it. And it was fascinating. It was on the evolution of development and coral and putting coral genes into flies. I mean, it was really fun
fascinating
stuff. Yeah, it was really fun stuff. But then bioethics was more thought through because I was looking for a course that would let me stay thinking about scientific issues, but being able to argue, thinking about the issues around them. I was quite argumentative in my 20s, so it seemed perfect. And I found the course at Monash University in Australia. And I did that, and then after that, I fell into the social sciences because that's where there was a job. And like you just make it work, right? Yeah, you find your path. Once you're in somewhere, it goes off in so many directions. You can choose which direction you want to move in.
What about you, Kate?
I did decide to go for botany specifically because I thought that producing plants that yielded more would solve the world's food problem. It didn't take me long once I got into the botany degree to realise it wasn't the botany degree that taught me it wasn't about food production, it was everything else I did at university. So much going on, extracurricular work there, it was really exciting, and that made me realise it was a justice issue, it was about access to food, and it wasn't about producing better yielding plants. But I stuck out the degree, and then I wanted to carry on in that direction. But actually, funnily enough, my botany degree was almost entirely genetics, and so almost the only thing I was fit for at the end of that was working in a lab, which was just horrific, the idea, and I wanted to be outside. And so I was looking for a different master's that had an overseas component, and I ended up doing a master's in forestry and land use, and that was still, food security was still a big part of that, partly because a lot of trees actually produce food. But also they're a very important source of income, and as I had realised by that point, you need an income to buy food and access food. So I did that master's, and then I didn't go straight into a PhD. I worked for several years, first an internship and then another job, and those got me very interested in lots of different things. They really gave me a wide range of experience, but I realised that I could ask intelligent questions, but I didn't have a field of expertise that I felt really strongly I could actually say something about, so I needed to go back to do a PhD. And I looked for a place to do a PhD, and I ended up in a geography department, which was perfect because it combined my social interests. Because my option when I chose my botany, my first degree in botany, my alternative option was history. It was a bit of a trade-off between the two because I loved history so much. So I had a very strong social inclination from the beginning, and geography department was really good to combine those two things.
So I think the lesson that I'm drawing from the three of you is that, you know, as when we're students, we spend so much time worrying about, am I picking is this the right subject for me? Am I going down the right path? But, you know, just a general direction is enough, and then you will find your way. So does anyone in the audience have any questions on this aspect?
Yeah, this is just directed to Gabby. I've got an opportunity to do a year abroad, and you said you went to Monash, and that was one of the options. How did you find your experience there?
I was actually in Australia for 12 years, and so I did my PhD out there, my first PhD, my second PhD here, and my master's out there. It's an amazing experience. It's absolutely, I would, just to go to different departments and experience different cultures and different ideas, it's brilliant. I would say go for it if you have the option to do so.
Oh, yeah, here. And then we can take 2 questions, and then, yeah.
Sorry, just drawing up on the last sentence, you said 2 PhDs and a
We will get to that.
Okay, all right.
So I will save your question for later.
Oh, that, all right, sure.
Ashwin, there's a question at the back.
So it was very interesting to know about your journeys. One of the questions that, because I'm right now doing my master's in sustainable cities. So one of the questions that, I have is, I've always wanted to work with, international governments, because from a very early age, I started looking at the atlas. It was the first thing that I did, I love finding out about new countries, new places, and that's what I enjoy the most. Which are the best pathways to, work with the government or work with international organizations? Like, would you say, like, especially for someone who's, this is like a second master's.
Okay. I think you've worked with a few international organizations.
I always feel like a fraud having to answer this question because it's really just hit and miss. It's really just about tenacity in approaching the organizations you want to work for. I was able, as a young person, to be supported by my parents to do unpaid internships, which I don't ethically agree with because it increases inequality, but I was able to do that. I asked to work for free for people, and then I got my foot in the door, and then I got experience that way. But I hustled. I think you've got to hustle. You've got to write to the people you want to work for, find the people, knock on doors, and get in that way. Certain masters have connections to policy. So, for example, like I teach the disasters, I don't know what it's called. Is it disaster adaptation development now? I've just come back. And we'll bring practitioners in, right? So we're going to bring practitioners in from the development sector, from the humanitarian sector to talk about, their jobs, but also how they got there, or at least just to widen people's networks a bit. But yeah, I don't have it's chance and graft, but also probably, for me, it's also it's not an equitable process, right? Because it's just about who's there at the right time to take an opportunity. But you've got to make sure that's you, basically.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I would say talk to as many people as you can, every opportunity you get. If you get to go to a workshop or someone comes in to give you a lecture, talk to them, take their card, write to them again 5 months later or something, say that you've now graduated, you're looking for something. Go to the careers office as well. They will point you in the direction of the few actual paid internships that there might be. But just networking is the key to, and then take on just about anything, as long as it's kind of ethically okay. Don't think, this is going to just put me down the one path. As long as it doesn't close too many doors, just take on something, even if it's just for a few weeks, it'll move you on to the next spot.
I do that now. I'd say I still do that. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to develop a research hub now in my area, which is sustainability, health and digital. And it's everywhere I go, I try and engage. Anyone that's talking somewhere at that intersection, I'm emailing them afterwards. Hi, this is what we do. Should we collaborate? Should we talk? And the more people, like I've had so many opportunities come out of that from kind of putting my initiative out there first. And of course, it's hard if you're looking for a job, obviously. But I think that idea of you just have to kind of push. I remember my friend when I went to Birmingham for biochemistry in my undergrad, and she couldn't get into any university, so she basically sat on Birmingham's doorstep for 3 days until they let her into the university, because her grades weren't good enough. And she just said, I sat there, I went back every day, and I just sat on their steps until they gave me a space. And they did in the end, which was fab because she's my really good friend now. But it's like you want something, you've got to just go for it.
Yeah. Persistence pays.
Yeah, persistence. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But if you do it enough, right? If you do it 20 times, then hopefully by the 21st time it will work.
Yeah. Once you've actually figured out what you want to study in your undergrad, you do your master's. But then comes the big question: should I do a PhD or not? And I did my master's here at King's, and I'm kind of interested in research, which is why not a day goes by for me at King's without someone asking me, are you planning to do a PhD? And my answer to that is always changing depending on my mood, sometimes the weather. So, how do you actually make that choice? And is that even a choice that you get to make? So let's hear from the next clip.
I thought I was a physical scientist, so I did natural sciences as my undergraduate degree. I did really well. I went straight to the UN Climate Change Convention, and I worked at the OECD in their climate change team. Everybody whose job I wanted had a PhD. My boss was like, Helen, you need to get a PhD. And so I actually left thinking I would return to the UN and take up a career there. As it turned out, as I was finishing my PhD, my boss wrote me into the way it works is you apply for a grant, you can write people into a grant. If you get the grant, I then had a job, and because I was so busy finishing my PhD, I didn't have time to think about what job I was going to take up, so I ended up doing a postdoc. I got a 4-year postdoc after finishing my PhD, and that kind of cemented it.
So Helen, would you say that the decision was made for you?
I'm glad you played that, because I was going to give you another answer, which shows how subjective it is depending on my mood. I mean, that was in academia. I think I probably I fell into academia because by the time I finished the postdoc, I was kind of here, and I realised I was as one of the people said, too critically thinking at that point to then go back into the UN. I think I'd sort of been changed. So yeah, I think the PhD, staying in academia definitely happened to me rather than I chose it myself, yeah.
And was your PhD in the natural sciences, or was it?
No, so this is where the kind of opportunistic bit came in. I was at the UN, and I was working in the adaptation team for the UNFCCC in Bonn, and I was like 23 or 4 or something, and I thought, well, what am I really good in right now? I'm really good in adaptation to climate change. Where are you most likely to fund me? So if I thought about what was most interesting, it probably wouldn't have been what. But I thought, well, who's the best in the UK for adaptation? That's Neil Adger. I wrote to Neil Adger, and we applied for funding, and I got it. So yeah, it was. I suppose I was strategic in what I applied to do.
What about you, Gabby? How did you decide you wanted to do that first PhD?
I was offered it, and I just thought, well, that seems like a good idea rather than going into the job market. And that's how superficial it was. But actually I didn't. I was offered a PhD in Imperial because I was at Birmingham at the time. And then I went on a gap year and got to Australia and then didn't want to leave. So I came back the summer later and went, I don't want to stay in London. So threw in that PhD and emailed someone in Australia near where I wanted to live and asked them if they had any PhDs, and they happened to have one, and then I applied for a scholarship and I got it. I'm really glad that I did, actually. But yeah, there was just no thought in it, and it was such a brilliant experience, my PhD. I look back on it, and I think I loved every moment of it, doing really cool stuff with fruit flies and going into coral spawns on the Great Barrier Reef. It was a really fun experience.
How about you, Kate? Was it a deliberate choice you made, and did you know what you were getting into?
I did, because after my master's, I was actually offered a PhD by my master's supervisor, but that PhD would have involved counting seedlings in Borneo for a year. And I just realised, you know, I went away and thought about it and thought, no, that really isn't me. It's not worth, you know, doing a PhD just for the sake of it if I'm going to spend a year just counting seedlings in a tropical forest in Borneo. So I'm more of a people person. So I went and did almost a year's worth of internship. They just covered my costs, so it wasn't quite paid, it wasn't quite voluntary, with the German aid organisation, GTZ as it was then. And I did that in Burkina Faso. And then I got a job completely by accident, wasn't even looking for it, at UNESCO. So we both went down the UN route in the dreadfully named Man and Biosphere programme. But it was a wonderful programme, the name aside. And that's where I was working on a programme on sustainable use of tropical forests. And I realised then that I needed to have a PhD to continue, really, because it was fascinating, but I just needed to get my teeth into something myself. And so I looked for funding, and I spent quite a lot of time looking for funding. And I was very fortunate that at the time there was a lot of money available for forests broadly, mostly tropical, but you know, generally speaking, for forests. And I was also lucky that I am German. I don't sound it, but the Germans were putting a huge amount of money in this, and they were funding me at UNESCO, and so I had lots of networks in Germany, and so I managed to get my PhD funded through the German system, where you get employed half-time to do some research for somebody, which for me was doing some research for Hamburg. They had a World Forestry Institute in Hamburg, and I was doing research in Benin on useful trees, and the other half of the time I was doing my PhD, which overlapped nicely in terms of topic. So that was very good, but it took me a while to, basically it was all the networking again, you know, talking to people, and especially because I wanted to convince the people in Hamburg that I didn't want to do my PhD in Germany in German, but I wanted to do it here in the UK, so that was a bit difficult. But,
Sounds like, you know, for some people it does take some time to sort of figure out exactly what you want to study and to get there. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Ashwin.
Again, you may wish to answer this one. Kant's theory of universal law. Since you're academics and teachers, would you rather teach the law because you're constrained by politicians, or would you teach the truth?
What? Did you catch that?
Shall I repeat that?
would I rather teach the law or
would
the
you
truth?
rather teach by the law, would you politicians constrain the universities, would you teach the truth? Would you feel confident enough to teach the truth?
I guess what I feel I teach is critical thinking, and sometimes the law can be quite good, but it can be misused. Truth is very much in the eye of the beholder. So, you know, I think my best experience when I started, because I came into academia, properly speaking, quite late into university, and one of my best experiences teaching was when a student came back to me and said, you know, I always come out of your class with more questions than when I come in. And that's what you want, really. You want people to start asking questions and to dig deeper and to look at whether people are using the tools that are out there, the policies, the laws, in the ways that are appropriate for achieving certain goals, and whether they're being honest about what they're doing, perhaps, as well.
Do you ever feel overwhelmed?
Sorry, do I feel...
Do you ever feel overwhelmed?
A lot of the time, yes, definitely. You know, there is so much going on where you, and often as an academic, perhaps you're curious about everything, and you have to, I find, I have to choose my battles, and, you know, I can't get engaged in everything because I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So it is about trying to think about, you know, which areas do I know something about. That's really why I wanted to do my PhD. You know, I wanted to understand, well, we want to conserve forests, but how do we go about it? And there's all these different ways of doing it. And now I've come to work on conservation, come back to conservation, because I'm really unhappy about how conservation is implemented, particularly in the global south, in the way that it affects local people very, very negatively. Yeah, it's trying to choose which areas you know enough about to be able to say something with with a bit of certainty and I don't know, strength. You know.
I think I feel overwhelmed also by all the debates around the specific topic that I'm working in, and then because I think quite a lot about what the moral thing to do is, and often there is no right or wrong answer. There is just complexity and, as you say, more questions than answers. So I feel often overwhelmed when people ask me questions like, what should we do now? And I'm like, it's really complex. I don't know the answer. I can talk to you about it for about 3 hours, but I can't give you the answer. And I go to bed at night thinking, oh, like, how can I work through this? Or how can I give people the knowledge that they need to work through it? And what knowledge should I be giving them? And what knowledge shouldn't I be giving them? And how can I give them that critical aspect, which I think is really important.
Thank you. Did we have another question?
I was just going to ask, do you find that speaking multiple language or 2 languages has been helpful for your pathway?
It has been hugely helpful, not just to get jobs, but also I think speaking different languages and being able to travel, which I did a lot as a child, just opens your eyes to different knowledge systems, different ways of thinking about things. And I don't know if I'd always grown up just in one place with one language, whether I would have developed that kind of openness that quickly. It really helped to be less judgmental about how other people see things, I think.
I have one of my own questions. If you are really interested in research, is there an alternative to doing a PhD? As in, can you go about research without doing a PhD? And is there so much competition in the market now that you can't get a research job without a PhD?
Oh, I don't know the answer.
What type of research as well? 'Cause
Like
I think it would depend.
Social science, qualitative, political science.
And as a career or as
a career?
As a career.
Like in a think tank or something, not in academia, but in a think tank or something.
I think it depends on how happy you are about not going too deep. I think a lot of the good research is done outside of academia, and the research, you think about consultancies, you think about, but yeah, you've got to move on quickly to the next thing. I think it depends whether you like research or you like a topic. And perhaps if you like a topic, then you're not going to be satisfied in a consultancy where you've got to move between. But if you like the act of researching, I think definitely you can do it outside. I would say. I don't know, what do you guys think?
There's so many interesting companies.
Private
Just at
sector,
the conference I've been at the last few days, which is Digital Health, and they're doing amazing research, and they're not all doctors, and there's definitely avenues for going into it. But I think it's right, it's how much you want to focus on one specific topic and get really, really expert and just stay there. As opposed to having something above you saying, all right, but now we're moving on to this, and now we're moving on to that. And I think that's something that I suppose you need to find out about yourself, what kind of person you are, if you're happy to stay and look at something in more and more detail, or if you kind of prefer that. So,
Do you have anything to add?
No.
No, that's all right.
I think it's increasingly difficult, perhaps, to do research without a PhD, and you often now need PhDs not just to do research, but there are more and more people. I think about 60% of people who do a PhD eventually don't end up in academia, and they move on, which is good. They move on into civil society, into government and business and all over the place. So a PhD doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up in research, I would say.
Okay. Did you have a question? Yeah, Ashwin.
So just to, just going back to that last point you just mentioned, right? Does that mean that, I'm trying to frame the question in my head, but something along the lines of doing a PhD does not necessarily mean going into academia at this point, right? Does that mean other jobs, outside of academia are looking for PhD degrees as well, even if it's not academic, or academia as such?
I would say definitely. And the training we provide to PhD students has changed completely. I mean, when I did my PhD, it was basically, okay, now you've got your money sorted out, fill in your registration forms, and then you might see your supervisor every now and again. I mean, during my year of field work, I got 3 letters from my supervisor. That was it, So you're pretty much on your own. And then at the end, you get signed off. But that's it. You're pretty much on your own in the cohorts that you've got. Nowadays, we provide so much training to PhDs on communication, on vast range of different research methods on impact and how to achieve societal impact. So I think we're trying to prepare PhD students for a much broader range of career options than just staying in academia.
Yeah, and I don't think academia could support all the
No.
PhDs that come through if they were to stay in academia. And we have, in our department, Global Health and Social Medicine, we certainly have PhDs come through. I haven't had any, but Annie can probably speak to this, that have gone on to do work in private sector, not NGOs and so forth, and had really great careers.
Okay, thank you for that. So, making the decision whether to do a PhD or not is a difficult one and sometimes a scary one, because you're worried that what if you make a wrong move and you go down a path? What happens then? Or maybe not a wrong move, just you realize that this is not what you want. So let's see something on that.
So my journey is quite long. It started when I did a PhD in molecular genetics many moons ago in Australia. And then I postdoced for a few years in molecular genetics, realised that lab work was not for me at all. So I did a master's in bioethics. And then finishing my master's, I moved into doing some work experience in a centre called the Centre for Values, Ethics and the Law in Medicine, because there weren't very many jobs at the time, and so that was the only way to kind of get my foot through the door. So I worked there on emerging technologies and the ethical and social issues associated with them. That's where I did so much learning in social sciences and really had to kind of change the way I thought. And I learned about writing papers in the social sciences, and I learned about empirical bioethics. But when I came back to London a few years later and I looked for a job, I couldn't find one because I didn't have a PhD in social science. So I was lucky enough to be offered a welcome PhD. And I conducted my PhD in medical sociology and finished that. And then from there, I've just been kind of moving more and more into the social sciences and sociology, building, I suppose, my abilities to conduct social science research and also think more theoretically about social science issues.
So Gabby, you enjoyed your first PhD, you told us, but what happened after that and what made you go down a different path? How did you come to that decision?
I think, to be as candid as possible, I grew up really late in life. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in quite a, how should I put this, right-wing environment.
Okay.
Very business-orientated family, and so I went straight into the sciences and straight into my PhD in science. And I never thought about social justice or anything. I didn't even know what these issues were because I was so focused on science. But I always had, like, my personality has always been about, it doesn't seem fair, like the way I'm living is not fair, something's not right. I had an issue with waste, like nothing seemed to add up. And as I moved progressively across, I started to use my working life as a growing, I don't know how to explain it, but like as a way for me to grow as a person. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I went in for my PhD interview to see if I could get my PhD, and they said to me, why have you chosen this particular PhD? And I said, because I want to grow as a person. Ever since, even just before then, life was black and white to me. Like, even when I did bioethics, it was like, this is right or it's wrong. There's no grey. And my PhD started a very long journey. Since then, it's been learning about the grey, both in terms of reading and other people's views, but also in reflecting on my biases and the issues that I had in the way that I was seeing the world. And it's been an extraordinary experience, really extraordinary. And I feel like I'm still growing, and I still, sometimes when I'm in a room with social scientists who have undergrads and postgrads in social science, I still feel like I've got imposter syndrome. But that's okay, because I'm in academia, and academia is about learning, and I'm old enough and wise enough to know that and appreciate it now.
And how did you feel when you got to know that you would have to do another PhD to actually work in the social sciences?
Frustrated, actually, because I'd got to the point of being a research fellow in the social sciences in Australia, and I'd put in for a large grant, 3-year grant. I did probably the equivalent to a 3-year UKRI grant here, and got it. So, and I was as a named postdoc, so it's the same kind of idea, but I basically wrote the grant because that's how it worked. Then the best chance to get the grant is to put your PI on there. And so I'd got to that level and I'd started working on it, and then came back here, and it was there were just no jobs basically without having that social science to fall back on in a form of a qualification. So I was frustrated, but then when I was offered to do a PhD, I was like, well, I love learning, so it's kind of like, I don't want to complain. Like, I could be out at work, this is a funded PhD, but did you have to take a drop in income? Must have taken a big I took a drop in massive drop in
that's-
income. Yeah. I think I still live like a student though. Like, I think a lot of the way that I live, and now that I'm married, my husband's just as bad as me. I hope this is going on YouTube, isn't it? But we're both like so careful with our money and trying not to spend too much. And so it's a huge drop in income. But again, this comes back from coming from a privileged background. So being able to manage that drop in income. But I spent most of my 20s living in dodgy rooms and shared accommodation to kind of pay my way through that way. So, but yeah.
Yeah, right.
Pretty-
There was a cost. It wasn't just the joy of learning. You did also have to
No,
suck
there
up,
was
like,
a massive cost, but it was a welcome PhD. So in the great scheme of things, they're
Yeah, good
generous.
funders, yeah.
They're generous. So you can pay and you can cover your head and you can buy food. So yeah, I wouldn't have been able to do it if I hadn't kind of met my now husband to kind of help with that.
Okay, fair.
It was interesting how you put it. You went from black and white to learning about the grey.
Yeah.
And I know that Helen, you also kind of had a switch from natural sciences to more of a social science bent. Did that change or shape the way you thought about the issues that you work on?
Yeah, 100%. I think mine happened slightly earlier than you, but I also think what's interesting about how we're talking is the role of our parents. Actually, basically, you slowly you're escaping the influence of your parents on your like even into your blooming 20s and 30s. So it's really pathetic, actually, isn't it? But so I suppose I hadn't even questioned that I would be a scientist because my parents were scientists. Struggled through science. I mean, I got a good result, but I struggled. But then, what changed it for me? You talk about moments and things. I met an anthropologist in Peru, the geographers will love it, who introduced me to the idea of neoliberalism that I'd never even, like foreign direct investment. These were his, and like because he was a social scientist, he lived and breathed these ideas, right?
Yeah.
They were as natural as anything to him, and I looked so green and naive and like kind of ridiculous, like super ridiculous, and that was the start for me. But I also think 4 years in the geography department at Exeter, also I think the being surrounded by more critical thinking then. So being in a development context, reflecting on that context, and then being in a critical department, definitely shifted. Yeah, and then there's no going back.
What about you, Kate? Were you always in touch with the social sciences from the beginning?
Yeah, they always really interested me. My mother was actually a social worker, so I had the social side, I think, from her, and the strong interest in justice from her as well as from my father. But when I decided to do my PhD, it was definitely going to be interdisciplinary because I knew I wanted to look at how people used the trees in their environment and whether if they were more valuable to local people, it would mean that they were more likely to conserve them because there was a big mantra of use them or lose them at the time, and that's what I wanted to kind of explore, that idea. And the person who was the absolute expert in the field, he was at Oxford, and I went to see him to ask him whether he'd supervise me, and he said no way because I had a bachelor's in botany and a master's in forestry, and here was me wanting to do something that combined, because I ended up doing a lot of botanical transects and so on, but I did market surveys, I did household interviews, I did focus groups and ethnography. Lived in these villages for a whole year. It was very interdisciplinary, and he became my examiner in the end. So he wasn't my supervisor, but I got him in the end, and he passed me, and so it was a really good experience, that one, having all those different strands.
Yeah. Nice. Now, so far we have talked about, how do we figure out what is the topic that you really want to study? But then there's also another question that's equally important. It is how you go about studying that subject. And I think these days there's a lot more conversations around that and around the power dynamics of knowledge production. So let's hear a clip on that.
The research that I produce is only ever going to come from a Western narrative. London or the UK and America are the kind of big names, if you would, or big geographies in the academic game, if you would. And what that means is, with me producing research in the future, I'm going to contribute to like kind of Western notions of research and knowledge production, which might sometimes not overstep but overshadow global south. And I say global south in commas, but different places. I'm thinking about, Latin America, the Caribbean, South Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia. There's different research that's taking place in these places that might not even be in English, that we don't engage with. So I think one of the biggest challenges for my own research is how to reconcile with that, and how to potentially to conduct research with other researchers from those geographies, for example, or how to ensure that my research isn't reinforcing that kind of UK-British relationship in a way. So I think I'm really thinking about what can I do in a way that, is it my citational practices? Do I draw on more scholars from the Global South? Do I take myself to the Global South, as we say?
So I know that some of you share those concerns, and Kate, you speak about this in your video too, about how you started off doing a lot of research on the Global South, but then as you gained more experience, you became more uncomfortable with that dynamic. So could you talk about that and how you navigate that now?
I don't think I've come to an answer about how I navigate it now, but I think it was not just doing research in the Global South, but doing research at small scale. So my PhD, I was working in 3 villages, and gradually I realised that how people were managing the trees in their own environment was not just down to their own decision making. Their decisions were constrained by a lot of things, both by local land tenure, but also by national processes, and also by national and international value chains. So the most important tree that I was looking at in that area was the shea tree, and a lot of you will know that shea butter is now very much an international product, and at the time it was just beginning to be an international product, and I followed the value chain all the way to Europe. And so that kind of opened my eyes to the fact that what's happening locally is not just in the gift of local people to decide upon, but they are constrained or enabled by policies and behaviours, consumption that's going on elsewhere. And as I've progressed with my research, I've become more aware that where I have a right to say something, where I have a democratic ability to vote and change policies, is not in the places where I'm doing the research, but is here. Here is where I vote, and so I feel like more and more this is where I have to start having a voice. It's quite hard to figure out, how does one do that? You also start off with research thinking, I think all researchers think that you need to provide more evidence, and it doesn't take long to realise that it's not a lack of evidence that is leading to bad policies and bad decisions. So it's a real challenge now to figure out, okay, what's the best way that I can use my set of skills, the evidence that I have, the networks I have, how can I use those to actually lead to some change? And I don't feel like I've got the answers. For me, being in an academic institution, part of my brain always says, well, at least you're teaching loads of fantastic students who are going to go and change the world, even if you can't. So that's one thing that helps me to sleep at night, that somebody else will, pick up the good ideas and hopefully through different avenues affect some change.
Yeah.
As an individual, you're never going to do it.
Yeah. How about you, Helen? I think you also speak in your video about doing more research collaborations with researchers in the Global South. So is that something that you're looking into?
Yeah, it's really similar to Kate, actually. It's the process of realising how cringe it is just to be there, and but then you are then an expert in that, so how do then you shift to being an expert in, But yeah, I think one of the ways that you can kind of respond to that is you start shifting to supporting academics in country, you shift to collaboration, you shift to co-production, and even kind of locally led, self-determination of local communities to decide what research is done and supporting those processes. And I think it's quite good that you're getting funders funding that now. UKRI is funding that, not across the board, but
So yeah, so there is that movement.
Gabby, do you want to add anything?
I've just started working with, I don't like using global north and global south because I think that there's differences between the different global south countries and same in global north in terms of different knowledge. I'm trying, sometimes I do, again, get imposter syndrome, white person coming in from good backgrounds, but I'm trying to do exactly what you say. So I'm writing a paper with a master's student in Kenya, kind of helping her through the process with another guy, a philosopher that's based in Kenya as well, because I had an idea of something I wanted to write about drawing on the philosophy of Ubuntu for ethics, my background's ethics, and kind of having that as a better way to kind of conceptualize some of the issues that are happening in Kenya around AI. But I didn't want to do that myself because I felt very uncomfortable doing that. So, and she was really keen to do it and to be first author on it. So we're just working together now where I'm kind of, we're all working together, but you know, it's her baby, it's her project. And so that's what I try and do to kind of work in that way. And then doing another project in India on e-waste. And again, it was my idea, but I feel uncomfortable there. So the girl that I'm working with has got her own research assistant now there, so it's kind of like her project, and I'm collaborating with her, so kind of setting it up that way, so that it's through knowledge sharing, and all knowledge therefore becomes valued rather than my knowledge being more important than anybody else's knowledge.
Yeah, knowledge sharing, collaborations. I think, Kate, also you've done some of this, right? Knowledge sharing and doing training.
Yeah, I think can't remember, it was right after COVID, the sort of real lockdown period, that I was involved in a project, very large project, UKRI funded, which was very much about capacity building for researchers in the Global South on food and water security. And we had a really good summer school in Malawi where we brought together researchers from across Africa. And most of the training was done by colleagues from Africa as well, but it was nice to have to be part of that and to see. We had a really active WhatsApp group, and it's still going. And even this morning, I got a WhatsApp message saying that one of the students had published a new paper, and they've published so many papers since we've had that summer school. It's just been really fantastic to see that.
Yeah, that must be rewarding, yeah.
I think it's just worth saying that in my department, and I haven't been that involved in it because I work on the environment, but in global health and social medicine, there's been a big move to decolonise the curriculum. I think they've got launched tomorrow around that. So there's been a lot of really fantastic work there, and we're really encouraged to bring in guest lecturers from other countries that are not the UK. So I don't know if that's is that a school-wide thing? You can have that in geography as well.
Well, we've got it hugely in geography on decolonisation. Yes, definitely. We had a big move a few years ago. We had some students that we employed to help us go through all our reading lists, and that was kind of the first mini step, towards decolonising. At least get the reading lists to be a bit more representative, and then to support different voices to come into the classroom as well. I'm not sure we've taken it far enough yet. It's a journey. There's not an end. It keeps moving. But yeah, definitely a huge interest to staff and students.
Can we take the questions later?
As you said, is on.
I just want to touch upon something that Kate talked about earlier, about wanting to change something, right? So I think a lot of people do come into research and academia with this intention of wanting to change something. So is that a realistic ideal to have or not? Let's hear something on that.
Yeah, I get more and more frustrated when I see that we produce lots of research about things that should be happening at the global level, like we should be ending funding for fossil fuels, we should be giving Indigenous people rights to manage their own resources. All of this is well documented by research, and yet it's not happening because of political will. And I feel like researchers need to start being a bit more active, a bit more ready to speak out at the national and international level to say we've done the research, listen to the research, and let's start thinking about how we can negotiate between different parties to manage to turn that into something that actually trickles back down to a proper decision on the ground. Because at the moment, you might as well not do research, frankly, because a lot of the really important research or research on really key issues is not being taken into consideration.
Oh dear, that's a difficult joke, isn't it?
It's a little provocative, but it's important to talk about when we have many young people here who also want to make an impact. So what did you find about making an impact once you actually got into this career? And yeah, have your ideas changed about how much of an impact you can make?
Well, I think the whole definition of impact is changing in academia as well. You know, there's still an element of impact is how many papers you write and how often they're cited. And fortunately, we're moving away from that and really getting to the idea, as you said at the beginning, of we all come into this wanting to change the world in some way, and let's see whether we can actually see some change as a result of our processes and our research. And I think there's research that shows that it takes a heck of a long time, sort of over 10 or 12 years, before some research actually gets from a published paper into having a visible change in policy. So we have to find ways of speeding that up, and I think that's the big challenge for researchers at the moment, is how to do that. There's no easy answer, but it's things like this, becoming better communicators, being willing to stand up. And I think I'm possibly fortunate that I'm getting to the end of my research career, and I'm now a professor. I don't have to worry about my job security that much, so I can afford to stand up and say things that are perhaps not so easy for younger people to say who are in less secure positions.
Okay. How about you, Helen? Did you want to make an impact or change something?
In my life, yes. I don't think I saw I didn't come into academia as the pathway for that. But of course, share Kate's frustrations about it. I think about, maybe it's playing devil's advocate because it's not how I think myself, but I think there is also, you need to have research for research's sake, right? Research and academia has to exist as a force because it serves a purpose in society without impact. But I do think the teaching's the biggest one. I do agree with Kate on that we're not going out in the world, but everybody else is, right? And so how you're getting to have all these conversations with, hundreds of students not hundreds every year, but, tens every year that then go out into the world. So maybe that's how I, like Kate said, sleep at night. But no, I didn't come into academia thinking this is how you make a difference. I came for quite selfish, the expertise that we needed to do something. But then I suppose we've ended up staying rather than going to do the something. No.
What about you, Gabby? Do you think you need to, is it necessary to want to make a change, or research for research's sake is also legitimate?
Definitely research for research's sake. I'm right with you. I think some people come in, and I think that's totally fine if you come in and and especially it depends on your field, right? When there's just so many times where you have just so much research and you're banging on the doors of policymakers and they're not listening, and it's incredibly frustrating. But at the same time, that's not why I came into research, although I am moving towards that now as my research uncovers that we do need to make some change. But I think it's always good to ask. That's what I teach my students in global health. What does success look like? What does it mean to have impact at the end of the day? And maybe success is, getting 100 people to think differently about the world, and they're going to go and tell 100 people each about the lecture that they had the other day, and so forth. So maybe that is what success looks like, now.
Yeah, so there are many challenges to being in academia and to being in research, but there's something that keeps people going. For some, it's the curiosity, but then it could also be something a little more intangible. And we have an anecdote on what it is that keeps Srilata going.
I decided to apply for a master's in development studies. And so I went to the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So as part of that process, I did some field work. I wrote about women who are involved in electoral politics at the grassroots level in the smallest of villages in rural India. If their participation in politics has an impact on their interpersonal gender relations at home, with their families, with their spouses and such. And I remember the first ever interview that I did. We went through like a series of, just the factual questions of like, how did you run your campaign and what do the meetings look like? And after I had sort of, built a rapport, I asked, so do you think your in-laws treat you any different since you came into this elected position? And I remember how she like sat up a bit straight and like her face changed, came closer to me, and in this like tone of, this is between you and me, but I'm going to tell you this, she was like, yes, it has. And I remember the feeling of that moment, and I kind of, I asked something meaningful, like this is something that is important to her and that she wants to share with me, that she wants to talk more about. And I think that is the feeling that I've been chasing for the rest of my career, pretty much, trying to find the people to whom I can ask meaningful questions and come back with this feeling of, having made meaning together.
Do you have any such moments, or what is it that keeps you going?
Well, fieldwork is lovely, but I haven't done much of it for a long time. But there is there's a wonderful, totally share Srilata's view of being able to talk to people. It doesn't really matter where that fieldwork is, whether it's here or in the countries where I've worked, more in the global south, but being able to talk to people about their lives and understand something about their lives and help them often understand something about their lives because they've never thought about it in the way that as an outsider you come and ask questions in a slightly different way. And so I definitely recognise the way Srilata puts it of creating shared meaning, because it's something new when you have two people from different perspectives talking about something. But I think intellectual curiosity is just what keeps me going. I just like learning new things all the time, and so that's.
And I suppose teaching as well.
Oh yeah, teaching is a wonderful way of learning, partly because you have to keep doing a lot of reading about what you're teaching, but mostly because of the students coming from a very, particularly at King's, we're lucky, very, very diverse body of students. And so if you have discussions in the classroom, you're always going to learn something new, and somebody's going to say, well, what do you think about this? And you think, oh yeah, haven't really thought about that, so let's think about it together.
What keeps you going, Gabby?
I think the intellectual curiosity, same as you, and the ability to learn. And learning not just from, I suppose, my own reading, but also, and not just students, because I've done quite a lot of teaching, and we'll be probably doing a lot more in the future, but I'm mainly research. But the people that I do conduct my research with as well, so I'm really interdisciplinary, and I work with people from all different disciplines, and learning from them I absolutely love. Like trying to understand when we've got interview data, like how they can see different things to what I see and how they construct meaning. So all of those kind of things I find absolutely fascinating. And then how you kind of bring all those ideas together to write a paper at the end of it. So I really enjoy that.
So do you have any advice to share for the next generation of researchers from your experiences on what to expect, or something that you would have liked to know when you were younger?
It's a journey. Do stuff because you think it's going to be interesting, and then just follow those paths. Keep talking to lots of people, and I think passion is what keeps you going in the end.
Because it's not the money.
No,
it's
and sometimes not the work-life balance.
Exactly.
Do we have any questions in the audience for the end? Okay, sure.
Do you think if you put a question, you don't answer it, the person asking the question can learn more from it?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think teaching is a process of asking questions and getting asked them, and often, I think as a young teacher, I always thought, I've got to be able to answer every question, and I quickly was disabused of that, and realised that actually the skill is in turning it around and getting people to think about, well, why have they asked that question and how would they answer it. So, yes.
There's one more question. You're all academics, you're all researchers. In politics, there are citizens' panels to determine policy. What theory, what statistical theory would you apply to get the answers accurate?
I think there's a lot of debate. In fact, we've just funded, through one of the funds here at King's, we've just funded a piece of research to look at how to make citizens' panels, citizens' assemblies more effective, which I think is really interesting because there's a question about whether how much effect they have on people during the citizens' assembly versus afterwards. You know, does it stay with people? Do they act on what they've learned or not? So I'm still not sure what the best type of democracy is in a sense, and how we get our democratic understanding to, you know, the people that can actually take decisions. I think we have to go with democracy, but imperfect, definitely.
Are there any more questions?
As part of the decolonising the curriculum process, do you think we should abandon the global north-south dichotomy?
The terminology?
Yeah.
You know, when I started out, this is a long time ago, you know, it was developed countries and developing countries, and then it's sort of emerging economies, and in fact, when I started out, it was underdeveloped countries and developed countries. Now I sort of feel that we're all developing, you know, but we basically all have different things that we need to develop forwards, if you like. I think for me, I do use the global south and the global north just because it's the most acceptable kind of categorization that I can use quickly. If I'm having an in-depth conversation with someone, then I'll avoid it and, you know, talk in more detail about the specific countries or the specific groups of people that I'm actually talking about. But I think it's still, for me, a reasonable set of terms to use in a fairly superficial setting.
Thank you. I think with that, we have come to the end of our conversation. Thank you so much for being here, for having this conversation with us and sharing your personal stories. We really appreciate it. And I also want to say thank you to my colleagues David, Ashwin and Aaron for helping us organize this today. We have a reception over here, so please help yourself to some drinks and snacks. A reminder that our series goes live on YouTube today, and you can watch it on our YouTube channel. We have a few QR codes around the room, so you can scan that and get to our channel. Yeah, and before I let you go, I just want to leave you with one last clip, which it talks about something that we have discussed here. And it's just to say thank you to everyone here, because you're all students in one way or the other. So be curious and keep going.
One of the things I really love about being in this department is being able to teach. And the undergraduates and the postgraduates that I work with are the most extraordinary cohort of young people. And it's just an amazing thing to be training a new generation of young people who want to get involved in that work. And I was really struck and actually humbled when I gave a lecture, which I often do on some years of the course, around the early years of the HIV pandemic in Australia. And many of them came up to me afterwards, really wanted to talk to me about the lecture. And we discussed that and the parallels between that historic experience and the way some people have experienced COVID in London. So I learned a lot from them and got a huge amount from their energy and engagement with the whole issue. And that's one of the things I really love about being here and working with that very interested and engaged student body.
With that, we close.